Hey everyone, this is a piece by Michael Walzer titled Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism and Anti-Semitism. Just a little intro about who Michael Walzer is. Michael Walzer is editor emeritus of the Democratic left magazine Dissent and an advisory editor of Fathom. Walzer argues here that, quote, when it comes to leftist debates about Israel, Zionism is the issue, and it is Zionism that we should talk about. He claims that, quote, what's wrong with anti-Zionism is anti-Zionism itself. Whether you are a, quote, anti-Semite, a philo-Semite, or Semitically indifferent, end quote, he argues, anti-Semitism is, quote, very bad anti-Zionism is, quote, very bad politics, end quote. This article was first published in Dissent, and we are grateful to Michael Walzer for his permission to make it available to Fathom readers. We hope it will be widely read in the British Labour Party. Michael's essay is part of a debate at Dissent, a reply from Joshua Leifer, and Michael's rejoinder can be read at the always excellent Dissent website. Section 1. Anti-Semitism, Jesus Christ, anti-Zionism is a flourishing politics today on many university campuses and on parts of the left, and the standard response from many Jewish organizations and from most of the Jews I know is to call it the newest version of anti-Semitism. But anti-Zionism is a subject in itself. Anti-Zionism comes in many varieties, and which ones are anti-Semitic? That's the question I want to address here. I take, quote, Zionism to mean a belief in the rightful existence of a Jewish state, nothing more. Anti-Zionism denies the rightfulness. My concern here is with left-wing anti-Zionism in the United States and Europe. Most versions of anti-Zionism first appeared among the Jews. The first and probably the oldest takes Zionism to be a Jewish heresy. According to Orthodox doctrine, the return of the Jews to Zion and the establishment of a state will be the work of the Messiah in the days to come. Until then, Jews are required to accept their exile, defer to Gentile rulers, and wait for divine deliverance. Political action is a usurpation of God's prerogative. Zionist writers hated the passivity that this doctrine produced with such passion that they were called anti-Semites by Orthodox Jews, who would never have given that name to their own rejection of the Zionist project. Quote, waiting for the Messiah, end quote, has a left version, which might be called, quote, waiting for the revolution, end quote. Jews and other minorities were often told that all their problems would be solved and could only be solved by the triumph of the proletariat. Many Jews took this to be an expression of hostility, a refusal to recognize the urgencies of their situation, but I don't see anti-Semitism here, only ideological rigidity and moral insensitivity. The second Jewish version of anti-Zionism was first proclaimed by the founders of Reform Judaism in 19th century Germany. There is no Jewish people, they insisted, only a community of faith, men and women of the Mosaic persuasion. Jews could be good Germans or good citizens of any state, since Jews were not a nation like the other nations and did not aspire to a state of their own. Zionism was perceived as a threat to these good Germans since it suggested that they had allegiance elsewhere. Many leftists have adopted this denial of Jewish peoplehood, and then they go on to claim that a Jewish state must be a religious state, something like a Catholic or Lutheran or Muslim state, political formations that no leftist could support. But Reform Jews adopted this position knowing that most of their fellow Jews didn't share it. If the nation is a daily referendum, as Ernest Renan said, the Jews of Eastern Europe, the great majority, were voting every day for peoplehood. They weren't all looking for a homeland in the land of Israel, but even the Bundists who hoped for autonomy in the Tsarist Empire were Jewish nationalists. The early reformers wanted to change the course and character of Jewish history. They weren't ignorant of that history. Leftists who argue against Jewish peoplehood are, mostly, ignorant. Leftists who argue against Jewish peoplehood aren't, however, the victims of what Catholic theologians call, quote, invincible ignorance, end quote. So we need to worry that they don't know, So we need to worry that what they don't know, they don't want to know. If they were interested, they could learn about the radical entanglement of religion and nation in Jewish history, and about its reasons. You cannot separate religion from politics. You cannot set up a, quote, wall between church or synagogue and state, if you don't have a state. Zionism was from its first days an effort to begin the process of disentanglement and to establish a state in which secularism could succeed. There are Jewish zealots in Israel today who oppose that effort, as there are Hindu nationalists and Muslim zealots who oppose similar efforts in their own states. One would expect leftists to defend secularism everywhere, which would require them to acknowledge the value of the original Zionist project. I won't say that it is anti-Semitic to assume lazily that Jewishness is a purely religious identity, but the refusal to recognize that large numbers of identified Jews are not religious is a little odd. We don't call them, quote, lapsed Jews, end quote, the way we call irreligious Catholics, quote, lapsed. They are simply Jews. The assumption that there is no Jewish people that includes the faithful and the faithless, which is so easily corrected, must have a reason. The assumption that there is no Jewish people that includes the faithful and the faithless enables leftists who have supported so many national liberation movements to deny that Zionism is a movement of that sort. Zionism can't be, because there is no Jewish nation, so it's a convenient argument, but that isn't a good reason for making it. The third version of Jewish anti-Zionism takes both religious and political forms. The religious argument serves also as an explanation of the long diaspora years. The Jews on this view are too good for statehood. The politics of sovereignty requires a toughness and brutality that are better suited to the Gentile nations. The Jews shaped by the Sinai covenant and by a long history of dispossession and persecution can't and shouldn't try to imitate the Gentiles. You might call this a philo-Semitic doctrine. The only difficulty is that it has no empirical basis. Even before 1948, the Jews survived as a nation in mostly hostile environments by using all the necessary political means, often with considerable skill. The political version of this argument isn't much better. It holds that the years of statelessness have turned the Jews into the first cosmopolitans. They are a people indeed, but a post-Westphalian people. Ahead of everyone else, they have transcended the nation-state. Zionism is a regression from diaspora universalism. But the Zionist achievement, the State of Israel, is a definite refutation of this characterization of the Jewish people. It reveals cosmopolitanism to be the program of some Jews, not a description of all Jews. And why should this be a program only, or first of all, for the Jews? Even if some Jews want to be cosmopolitans, a light unto the nations, or better, a light against the nations, why do so many non-Jewish leftists insist that all Jews take on this role, rather than claiming it for themselves? I can think of better candidates for a post-Westphalian politics. Let the French transcend the nation-state. After all, the French started the whole business with the Levée en Masse of 1793. The Marseillaise, the first national anthem, the tricolor, the first national flag, and all the revolutionary oaths, or the Germans, or the Danes, or the Poles, or the Chinese, ... So here is the rub. The most common leftist version of anti-Zionism derives, so its protagonists say, from a strong opposition to nationalism and the nation-state. Early on in the history of the left, this was a plausible argument with wide extension, and it was made by many Jews. Rosa Luxemburg, for example, wrote with equal loathing about Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Czechs, Jews, and, quote, 10 new nations of the Caucasus, ... rotting corpses, bracket that, end bracket, climb up out of 100-year-old graves, ... and feel a passionate urge to form states, end quote, ... end quote. The only thing I admire about Luxemburg's loathing is its universalism, but that's precisely the feature missing from much contemporary leftism, where the loathing is much more limited. There have been opportunities for the application of Luxemburg's argument. The second half of the 20th century saw the collapse of the British, French, and Soviet empires and the creation of more nation-states than had existed in all of world history. Until then, a few leftists dreamed of turning the old empires into democratic federations, but most supported pretty much all the post-imperial creations, with less enthusiasm perhaps in the Soviet case, except one. Think of missed chances to oppose the nation-state. Why support Vietnamese nationalism, for example, when the obviously correct position with regard to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the three parts of Indochina, was one multinational state? Why didn't leftists call for the incorporation of Algeria as a province of France, with its citizens enjoying all the rights proclaimed by the French Revolution? The Algerian FLN, championed by the international left, instead created a nation-state that has failed dismally to deliver those rights. I remember how enthusiastically people on the left were about UNU's Burma, now Myanmar, and a prime example of what is wrong with nationalism. Burma should have been a province of India, bringing Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims together in one state, but no one on the left argued for that. The British ruled Sudan as the, quote, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and surely the two African countries, freed from Anglo-imperialism, should have joined one state. Why didn't leftists object to Sudanese liberation, or to the Eritrean separation from Ethiopia? Why didn't they call for one Baltic state instead of the nationalist threesome Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia? I could pose many similar questions, but there is a single answer to all of them. The nation-state was, in all of these cases, the people's choice, the democratic option, even if it didn't lead to democracy. So leftists were right to support the Vietnamese, the Algerians, and all the others. But then, why not the Jews? And why, now that a Jewish state exists and is very much like all the other states, is the Jewish state the one on the receiving end of such a singular version of Luxemburgian loathing? I think I'm a little more sympathetic to Luxemburg's position than Walzer, but that is definitely like the thing. The one place that's supposed to be not nationalist and is supposed to, there's one place that's supposed to be not nationalist, and it's one place that's supposed to be cosmopolitan and forfeit its right to statehood, forfeit its right to like a nation state. There's one people that's supposed to do that, and it's the Jewish people. It's not applied to literally any other. National self-determination is celebrated. Granted, like Walzer is saying here, that national self-determination has nothing, really very little to do with the self-determination of actual human beings. The national self-determination of Algeria, as he mentioned earlier when he said it failed dismally to provide the democratic rights that were promised by the French Republic, Obviously, those rights under the French Republic are very limited from a socialist perspective, but what he's saying there, I think, is he's saying two things that I think are interesting, and not that, this is just a side note to myself, is that, the one is like, why cosmopolitanism for one people, right? Why only one cosmopolitanism to be forced upon one people when cosmopolitanism is not supported by the left generally in terms of all the other nation states. The other thing is, sorry, that's just all I'm saying. Just talking to myself. Yeah. I think that also, one of the interesting things, sorry, this is actually what I was about to say. If you watch, like, there's a talk about, like, leftist perspectives on the Ukraine that the Platypus Affiliated Society put out, and it had a bunch of people. It had some, some people from, like, Cosmonaut, and then it had, like, some, like, guy from, like, Oakland DSA or whatever, and then it had this guy, Thomas Van Osten Zaken, who is, like, a journalist who's, done a lot of, like, field work, a lot of journalistic work in the Middle East, like, on site. And is involved with various organizations, and he's like he comes from, I believe, like, kind of like the anti-Deutsch milieu, the anti-nationalist milieu in Germany, and he's talking about, like, the debates between Luxemburg and Lenin on the nation state, and how he's always agreed with Luxemburg overall. But granted the overall system of nation states, this kind of, like, critique of the nation state, and critique of nationalism, and critique of, like, separatism, and, like, the bolstering of large, often hierarchical in the sense that they're particularistic, national identities, instead of fostering that, he generally seemed like he agreed with that. But what he said is that what is true of Lenin's thing is that within the system of nation states, and this wouldn't be even an argument that Luxemburg would make. They're talking about Ukraine, and he was saying that, like, in the system of nation states, it's not just for one nation state to destroy another nation state. It's not emancipatory or cosmopolitan for, say, I don't know, for Hamas to victoriously wage a war against Israel and destroy the state of Israel and establish a single nation state, or have the international community put pressure militarily or otherwise for Israel to dissolve itself on Israel. This idea that kind of, like, you see this in, like, kind of like anarchist world, where they're kind of like don't really see what is the problem with calling for the elimination of particular states individual. After all, like, don't we hate all states? Don't we advocate for a stateless society? Why would you defend the right of a particular state to exist? Aren't we anarchists? And it's like, okay, yeah, that's true. Like, I am opposed to the nation-state system. But within the nation-state system, like, that entails a certain respecting of boundaries by other bodies, right? So, like, it's not an anarchist solution to the problem of the nation-state for Russia to annex Ukraine, right? It's not a blow against the nation state for the Jewish state of all states to be dissolved by pressures from pressures for a one state solution, when the hypothetical partners in that one state solution would include the Likud party and Hamas. That's not viable. That's not on planet Earth. So this kind of, like, I don't know. So it's like, yes, cosmopolitanism should be an ambition, but you shouldn't use cosmopolitan arguments against one specific entity, I suppose, is what Walzer's saying here. Is that yeah, like we're cosmopolitan communists. We're against nation states. So like of course we'd be against Zionism, but they're literally not against any other nationalism with all of the problems that has historically entailed. Yeah. And it's not just nationalism of the first world. I don't know if you'd be pressed to say that like the ethnic violence in Yugoslavia was was some kind of like immediately the cause of like the West or something like that, pressing down on Yugoslavia. And it would be hard to say that about like Khmer nationalism in the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot's Cambodia. You'd be hard pressed to say that like the kind of like, with the nationalistic part being the racist nationalist dimension of Kampuchea being one element amongst others of why that was an extremely problematic regime. You can't reduce what's wrong with nationalism to just like the nationalism of like the powerful countries, the ostensibly imperialist countries. Sorry, I'm just rambling. I'm fucking up this whole recording, but I'm having some thoughts, so I'm gonna say them. So forgive me. Forgive me, please. Section 3. The common answers to that last question are, first, that the creation of the State of Israel required the displacement of 700,000 Palestinians. Israel is a, quote, settler colonial state, like many other states if you go back far enough, but let's leave that aside. The more immediate history is telling. There was no displacement of Palestinian Arabs in the 1920s and 1930s, despite Zionist colonization. The Arab population actually grew not only because of the birth rate, but also because of immigration, mostly from Syria. The first British census in 1922 showed an Arab population of 660,267. The figure for 1940 was 1,063,433. There was no displacement during the Second World War when Jewish migration slowed. Or immigration slowed, and the State of Israel was proclaimed, first by the UN in 1947 and then in Tel Aviv in 1948, before the large-scale displacement began. So the idea that statehood, quote, required displacement can't be right. It was the invasion of the new state by 5 Arab armies that led both to the flight of many Palestinian Arabs. Jews didn't flee because they had no place to go, and the expulsion of many others. Jews weren't expelled because the Arab armies lost the war. The numbers who fled and were expelled are fiercely debated. They were large in both cases. Still, without the war, there would be nothing to debate. Very few refugees would be in camps today. The Nakba was a tragedy that took 2 agents, 2 political movements, and soldiers from both sides to produce. And what about the flights and expulsions that have happened elsewhere? Most obviously when the modern states of Turkey and Pakistan were created. Oddly, I haven't heard the legitimacy of those states questioned by leftist writers, even when the policies of their governments are criticized as they should be. The force of, quote, whataboutism, end quote, is often denied, but I think it is a powerful critique of one-eyed men and women who show great indignation at events here, wherever here is, and no interest at all in similar events elsewhere. Surely the phenomenon ought to be noticed. But the second reason often given for anti-Zionism, Israel oppresses the Palestinians both in Israel proper and in the occupied West Bank. I won't address the more toxic forms of this critique, that Israel is a Nazi-like state, a uniquely evil state, a child-killer state, which do in fact reinvent or update the tropes of classic anti-Semitism. But there is much to criticize. My Zionist friends in Israel have fought for years for full equality at home and against the cruelties of the occupation and the zealotry of the settler movement. Fierce opposition to the policies of the current Israeli government as of August 2019, with no improvement in sight, seems justified to me. The fiercer the better. I will provide a list of what needs to be said, since I want to be recognized as a defender of Zionism, but not an apologist for what people calling themselves Zionists are doing in Israel today, and were doing yesterday too. Defenders of Palestinian nationalism might consider providing a similar list of the pathologies of Palestinian politics. Israel's Arab citizens face discrimination in many areas of common life, especially in housing and the appropriation of state funds for education and infrastructure. With the recent nation-state law, the Knesset in effect gave the finger to its Arab citizens. Though the law has no legal consequences, it announces a second-class citizenship. The West Bank is a scene of invasive settlement, seizure of land and water, and lawless military rule. Settler thugs act violently against Palestinians on a daily basis without effective restraint from the Israeli police or army. The current government uses anti-Arab incitement as a method of rule and is aiming at a single state dominated by what will soon be a Jewish minority. I will come back to, quote, one state, end quote, later. There is more, but this will be enough to make the point. Criticism of this sort has nothing to do with anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism. These are the policies of governments. But governments only rule states. They do not embody states. Governments come and go, at least we hope governments come and go, while states endure for the sake of the men and women whose common life they protect. So criticizing the government of Israel shouldn't involve opposition to the existence of the state. The brutality of the French in Algeria required fierce criticism, but none of the critics I remembered opposed French statehood. The brutal treatment of Muslims in Western China today calls for fierce criticism, but no one is demanding the abolition of the Chinese state, although China is, in practice, if not in theory, a Han nation-state. Leftists claim that long years of the occupation and the right-wing nationalism of the Netanyahu government reveal the, quote, essential character, end quote, of the Jewish state. This must be awkward for those men and women on the left who learned long ago, chiefly from feminist writers, to renounce essentialist arguments. Does the long history of intervention in Central America reveal the essential character of the United States? Maybe the opponents of intervention and occupation are more essential. Anyway, do states really have essences? Many leftists these days simply endorse Palestinian nationalism without worrying about its essential character, even thinking about the program of the nationalists, who are often explicit in demanding the whole thing, quote, from the river to the sea, end quote. There are Zionist Jews in the government today who make the same demand with equal fervor. Surely leftists should oppose both with a similarly determined position. Those leftists who call for, quote, one state with equal rights for Jews and Palestinians would probably say that they are doing exactly that. Theirs is a program that seems to reflect a consistent abhorrence of nationalism in the nation-state, consistent at least in this one case. But, quote, one state, end quote, means the elimination of one state, the existing Jewish state, and how exactly are the, quote, one-staters, end quote, going to achieve that? How do they plan to defeat the Jewish state and the national movement that produced the Jewish state? Or alternatively, how do they plan to defeat Palestinian nationalism? What would the whole new state look like, and who would make decisions about immigration policy? Immigration is the issue that scuttled by nationalism in the years before and immediately after the Second World War. Finally, what if the new state, the most likely outcome, looked very much like Lebanon today? Given recent Middle Eastern history and given the history of Israel-Palestine, a peaceful coexistence and equal rights under one government is a very sweet fantasy, but a fantasy still. Surely it would be better to add a state rather than subtract one, and allow both national movements to attain or hold on to the sovereignty they seek. The two-state solution may also be a fantasy. There are significant political forces on both sides aligned against it. But there is also realism here. We know how to create nation-states. There is a lot of experience to build on. We don't know how to create the ideal political community that the one-staters claim to want. And we don't want or shouldn't want the kind of state they are likely to create. Creating nation-states, that's pretty much the policy leftists have defended throughout the post-colonial period. Yugoslavia is the obvious exception, where many leftists oppose the creation of 7 new nation-states, preferring the tyrannical regime that once held the 7 nations together. Another inconsistency. If tyranny is the alternative to national liberation, leftists should and most often do choose liberation, and the choice is a good one, for there is a lot of evidence that nations need states, often to protect those nations from foreign oppression. You can take the evidence for this from the history of the Jews, or the Armenians, or the Kurds, or the Kosovars, or the Palestinians. The strongest political force in all these countries aim at a state of their own, and if the other 4, why not the Jews? Section 4. Why not Zionism? Because the Jews aren't a people. Because the Jews should be more cosmopolitan than anyone else. Because the Zionist state has had some terrible governments. Because no one should have a state, even if almost everyone does. Each of these claims can be made and reasons given, but the way they are made in the world today is bound to arouse suspicion. It is at least possible, and sometimes it seems likely, that the people making them also believe that Jews ran the slave trade, that the Zionist lobby controls U.S. foreign policies, as Representative Ilhan Omar has said, that Jews are disloyal to every country in which they live except Israel, and that Jewish bankers control the international financial system. There are too many men and women who believe these things on the left as well as on the right. They are anti-Semites or fellow travelers of anti-Semites, and their anti-Zionism is probably tightly connected to their anti-Semitism, though they are now pro-Israel anti-Semites among, for example, American evangelicals and the Eastern European right-wing nationalists. Men and women on the left need to be sharply critical, especially critical of other leftists who hold these views. It is obviously easier to condemn right-wing anti-Semites and pretend that anti-Semitism doesn't exist on the left. But it does. Indeed, it has been a regular topic here in dissent. See, among others, George Lichtheim, Socialism and the Jews, July-August 1968, and Mitchell Cohen, Anti-Semitism and the Left That Doesn't Learn, January 2008. It may well be true that right-wing anti-Semitism poses the greater danger to Jewish well-being, but the leftist version should not be underestimated. Still, I am sure that a lot of anti-Zionists and many leftist anti-Zionists don't believe any of the anti-Semitic fables. Maybe they are willfully ignorant about the Jewish people. Maybe they are peculiarly focused on the Jewish state. Maybe they just don't like Jews, as George Carey, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, said about Jeremy Corbyn. Maybe. But when it comes to leftist debates about Israel, Zionism is the issue, and it is Zionism that we should talk about. For all the reasons I've given, what's wrong with anti-Zionism is anti-Zionism itself. Whether you are an anti-Semite, a philo-Semite, or Semitically indifferent, this is a very bad politics.